Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Cultivating a Generation of Hope and Resilience, our final panel of Jewish World Watch's second annual Impact in Action. I'm Serena Oberstein, the Executive Director of Jewish World Watch, an anti-genocide and mass atrocities nonprofit based in Los Angeles. Rooted in our own experiences of persecution, Jewish traditions, and values, Jewish World Watch was founded in 2004 to combat the silence and genocide in Darfur. More than 17 years later, genocide and mass atrocities are still rampant, and we're obligated to ensure that never again is a call to action. Impact in Action highlights Jewish World Watch's robust portfolio in the ways we fulfill our mission through education, empowerment projects, and our advocacy work. Oftentimes at Jewish World Watch, people want to know tangibly what it means to combat genocide and mass atrocities, to mitigate the aftermath, to allay the recidivism. And I hope that this conversation with several of our partners on the ground, as well as some outside experts, will give you an aperture into that work and why education is such an interwoven theme into our empowerment projects. The lack of access to education can cause societal brokenness, violence, extreme levels of poverty. The denial of education is also a mechanism for authoritarian regimes and ill-intended elected leaders to successfully perpetuate cultural erasure and disenfranchise populations for generations. However, when education models are holistic and include compassion, dignity, and empowerment, it can serve as a gateway for upward mobility and a life far beyond the confines of the generations that have come before. The power and dedication of the people on this panel is not only inspiring, they are changing the course of the future through their work by teaching young people how to find their voices and how to use them. I hope it galvanizes you to take action by visiting our website, engaging in our work more deeply, joining a committee, and inviting us into your community or giving financially. I'm particularly excited about this group of highly esteemed human rights and youth advocates and practitioners. Founding director of Action Kivu and the co-founder and executive director of ABFEC, as well as, excuse my dog, as the Congo Peace School and longtime Jewish World Watch partner and friend, Amani Mataboro Tom. Children on the Edge Asia Regional Manager, overseeing and managing the work of Rohingya refugees in the largest refugee camp in the world, John Littleton, as well as two fierce advocates for children here in Los Angeles. Executive Director of Great Public Schools Now, Dr. Anna Ponce, and Vice President of the Los Angeles Unified School District Board of Education, representing District 4, Nick Melvoin. Each of these people work with the world's most precious resource, our young people. Their unique circumstances led them to architect holistic approaches to cultivating a generation with access to knowledge and opportunity. They are each dogged fighters for our children and set the example for how we all can live our values into the world. In just a few moments, you'll hear from the indelible Dr. Corey Street, currently Senior Director of Programs and Operations and incoming CEO for the Shoah Foundation. Dr. Street has spent a decade leading the Institute's academic, education, and administration initiatives with Reach scholars, educators, and students in 80 countries. Dr. Street also spearheaded the Stronger Than Hate initiative, bringing the Institute's programming and ethos to the greater USC campus community. Their current academic work is focused on the preservation and educational use of Holocaust survivor testimonies and the role of testimony in addressing the history of mass violence. Their other areas of research are problem-based learning and the integration of information literacy into the classroom. Before we hear from Dr. Street, we'll watch a short testimony given by Hetty Fried, who survived Auschwitz, as well as Bergen-Belsen, on why she has hope. Thank you again for being here and for holding up the world together.
I have hope for the future because I see that it gets a little better after time, and then it goes down, and then a little better again, and it goes down a little better again. Now we are down. I hope the next step will be up. As the world looks today, actually you have difficulties in being optimistical. You have all these threats. But you had all the stress, all the threats even previously, and you went through it, and it took a better turn. Maybe again we have to lose lots of people, I don't know, but it will be better. And even if rationally I ought to lose hope, I don't. Because if I would lose hope, I would lose the meaning of my existence. So I still feel, when I went back to Auschwitz, I saw small flowers. I could hear the voices of the ghosts walking around. I could hear the dogs barking. I could hear the Germans shouting. I could even feel the sticks on my back. But I could see the small blue flowers, and I could keep up the hope. That's how it is. Somebody has to.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Serena, for starting us off. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you. I know we've got people joining us from all over the world today, and welcome to our illustrious panel. I'm joining from Los Angeles in Southern California, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Tonga and their neighbors who have taken care of these lands for generations. I acknowledge that we are guests here today, and we are guests here on Zoom, and thank you to Jewish World Watch for bringing us all together. What a remarkable group that you have the opportunity to meet with and hear from today. I'm literally humbled to be among Amani, Nick, Dr. Ponce, John. All of you are doing so much of the heavy lifting with JWW to do what Hedy is suggesting we all do, which is to look up when it feels like the world and the traumas that we're all facing are conspiring to pull us down. As Serena said, today is the second part of a powerful conversation that y'all have been leading on cultivating a generation of hope and resilience. And that is a big, a tall order for sure. And we're going to really get into today how education and educational resources can intervene in the cycle of violence, the cycle of trauma, the cycle of poverty, and to give hope and opportunity to young people, help them to develop the skills, knowledge, dispositions that can help them have a better future and help create a better future. And I think we're seeing a lot of that today. For example, on our campus at USC, our junior interns, which are kids prior to university, are there for our junior intern, our William P. Lauder junior intern program. That's all about developing the leadership capacity in young people to counter hatred and to stand up for a better world. Each of us are part of finding ways to cultivate that generation, and the trauma that we're experiencing, a re-traumatization for some of us. Amani, I just thank you for being here at such a difficult time. For some of us, the traumas are much more present, but we're all experiencing the trauma, whether it's of the pandemic or more realistically, and looking at how we join in this endeavor to solve for this problem. But to kick it off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to first locate themselves and introduce themselves to you, but to also talk about the trauma that they and the populations they serve are experiencing right now. So I'm just going to go down the list. Amani, let's start with you, and then we'll run the board. And Nick, I won't point out too often that you were an intern at the USC Shoah Foundation, but welcome back. So Amani, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what kind of trauma your audiences are working with? And let's get the panel started.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. I am Amani Matabaro Tom. I am speaking from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the eastern part of the country. I don't know what to say exactly when it comes to trauma. I am 44 and I've seen nothing than trauma in my life. It has been a cycle. Trauma has been cyclic in the Congo, where I am where I am right now. The country has never been at peace. We went from slavery to wars, slavery from King Leopold II back in the 1883, and then slavery ends, independence in the 1960s. But now, from all those periods, the country has never been at peace. Right now, as I am speaking to you, masses of people are being forced to flee their country and crossing the border to Uganda. That is in the northeast of the Congo. Right now, as I am speaking to you, masses of people close to where I am, near Uvira, on the border between DRC and Burundi, masses of people are being forced to flee the country because of the violence, because of armed groups, because of armed forces fighting on and on and on. So for me, trauma, it is this displacement. Trauma is this lack of shelter. Trauma is lack of access to education by millions of children. We have around 7 million of children aged between 5 and 17 who have no access to education, whereas they are in the age to be in school, but they can't access education. People living in extreme poverty. We are in a situation where there is no social justice, where there is a dysfunctional government, political instability, and all these things together, again, women and young girls being subjected to gang rape. And as you know all, rape has been country and illicit exploitation of natural resources in the country. So we live in a very rich country when it comes to natural resources, but paradoxically, the people are extremely poor. The country is as rich in natural resources as it is in stories. So all this together is the type of trauma we are living in. And I don't know. 2 days ago, I shared a video. I sent a video to Serena, trying to show her how masses of people and children and women are the mostly affected by the ongoing cycle of violence and trauma in the Eastern Congo, where I am right now. So children being forced to flee, children having no access to education, all these things together is the type of trauma I am living in, I've been living in, but never lose hope.
That's amazing. And so what a remarkable story of just even starting us off. John, let's go to you. You're also far away in terms of where your work takes you. So can you locate yourself? Where are you? What's the trauma that's facing you?
Certainly. My name is John Littleton, and I manage the Asia region for a UK-based charity called Children on the Edge. And our fundamental purpose is to find the most overlooked populations of children in the world, and then find those who are bringing assistance, and then working with them to bring further advocacy and exposure to the issues, as well as support. So back in 2009, that actually led us to the Rohingya people, who are a Muslim majority people who have straddled the Bangladesh-Myanmar border for hundreds of years, and have been systematically persecuted in Myanmar for really systematically beginning in the 1970s, though other prejudices predated that. There was more of a systematic approach to that prejudice and persecution beginning in the 70s. But it didn't really reach full crescendo until late 2016, when there was, what is classified by the United Nations as a genocide against the people there in Rakhine State in northern Myanmar. And so we were already active there for the 7 years prior to that, and then became more involved after that, just because of our presence being there. Prior to that point, we were the only agency providing education in the what they call the makeshift camp, because for the 11 years preceding the genocide, no formal education was allowed to newcoming refugees and asylum seekers there. So there was only unofficial education, and we negotiated to be able to provide that prior to the genocide. Since that time, what we found is that the future of the Rohingya people still largely remains out of their hands. It's being bargained and negotiated by power brokers in the region and by greater political powers, but they still have very little future, very little say in their future. They remain stateless, and even their requests for education are being litigated. At this point, they're not allowed to be taught in their own language or the language of their host country. There's a strong push to have them educated in the Burmese language with the Myanmar government curriculum of the government that just literally committed atrocities against them. And they have very few prospects of resettlement or statehood at the moment. So we are walking a tightrope of trying to be respectful of the government, which is graciously hosting them, but also be a strong voice to say, to advocate for their rights and to impress upon people, governments, non-government agencies, and just people that care that education is the key to shaping the future of these people in the refugee camps and beyond. And so without concerted effort to bring meaningful education, the next generation of Rohingya will be unable to make their own opportunities and self-determination. So we're very passionate about that, and we're trying to take some innovative steps I can talk about later about how we think we can go about doing that.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Many of the testimonies that we took in Bangladesh of the Rohingya who are fleeing for their lives talk about that feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of having so little control over their lives and what that does to a person. And I'm struck by, what you're talking about in terms of education, how similar it is to the dark history of part of how cultures have treated First Nations that really there's a reckoning for in places like Canada and Australia, New Zealand right now. So Dr. Ponce, locate yourself for us.
Hello, everyone. I am in Los Angeles. I'm also in the Tongva land here where I live. And I come into this space first. I want to thank Amani and John for sharing and want to acknowledge the privilege with which I come to this space compared to some of the challenges that are happening across the globe. So I come into this space, through my personal experience as an undocumented immigrant growing up in poverty as an English language learner in Pico Union, a community that was a first stop immigrant community where there was tons of trauma all around me, where we just saw it every single day in our household, on our streets, in our schools. And one of the things that early on I started to pay attention to was how each of us was experiencing that trauma. And there were two ways. There was the constructive and the destructive way. And really what influenced that was the experience that we had in school and whether we had an adult that we can connect with or not. And I saw many of my neighbors' children, many of my peers, die or enter the system. And it all came back to education. And the other issue also in my community, in my family, was the perception of mental health. And, mental health was just not something that was supported. And, if you talked about getting support, it was like, well, you're a little crazy, and we had to overcome a lot of that. So that takes me to being a system leader at Camino Nuevo and working in the same community that I grew up in and really trying to figure out how do we create these environments where kids can heal, where they can thrive, where we can bring their families to support them. And today we have the pandemic, and I'm thinking about, the challenges that we had beforehand and how all of those have just been magnified, particularly for, kids that come from the same background that I do. And also seeing how we all have to be part of the solution. As a volunteer at a school, I have a responsibility to ensure that kids feel seen and heard as much as any other adult in that community. And the challenges are significant and they're different. And I think that we all play a role in how we move forward from this pandemic.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ponce. What a lovely reminder, and thank you for sharing about acknowledging all of our privilege. And I'd love, and I want to come back to that construct that you started with the pathways of how we're responsive, and particularly the role that school plays in that. So last but certainly not least, Nick from LAUSD. Locate yourself, introduce yourself. What kind of trauma are the students here experiencing? And feel free to talk about the glory heady days of being an intern at USC Shoah Foundation.
Yeah, well, I was an intern back in the day when we were still just trailers on the Universal lot, and before we had some fancy, you alluded, Dr. Street, to some like fancy name for the interns. Like I was just some random high school kid who weaseled my way into there, spent my summer with survivors, and it was really formative because it was around that time that I also started volunteering at a camp that I now run for homeless and underserved kids. And Dr. Ponce and I have worked together. We work with Camino in that endeavor that really catalyzed my interest in working with youth and working with children. But it is a privilege to be here with you all today. And speaking of privilege, like Dr. Ponce said, I mean, just perspective is important. And even in the midst of this pandemic in a district where over 80% of kids are living in poverty, which I'll speak about, just hearing the experiences of students and families around the world is grounding. So thank you to John and Amani for joining us. Catalyzed by that experience, volunteering both at the Shoah Foundation and at Camp Harmony, I began my career as a teacher in South LA and Watts, and came to a school in 2008 where only 4% of the 8th graders were proficient in math, and where the year before I got there, the assistant principal was arrested for raping a student. This was about 20 minutes where I grew up in Brentwood on the west side of LA. And we kind of talk a lot about the proverbial other side of the tracks, and it really was driving from Brentwood into Watts, which felt at the time like another country. There's a parable that I'm sure some folks are familiar with of a group of townspeople standing by a river when a baby starts floating down. And one of the townspeople runs in the river to get the baby, but just as quickly, another baby comes floating down, and soon there are more than can be counted. And so someone starts running upstream, and the villagers say, well, where are you going? We have to get these babies out of the river. And he says, I'm going to find out why they're falling in the first place. That, I think about that because I'm sure there's similarities between all of us on the panel. But, my career for the last decade plus has been trying to figure out why those babies are falling into the river. So I started teaching in 2008. I got fired when the recession hit, and schools like mine lost 70% of our teachers. And so my kids, who had already been experiencing a lot of trauma, were getting their legs really kicked out from under them because they were losing their teachers. Ended up suing the school district on behalf of some of my students, and thought I'd go down a path of civil rights law, and then ultimately ended up at the school board trying, like many of you, on the systemic level to help kids. LA Unified, about 700,000 kids if you include charter schools and pre-K and adult schools, and 82% of those kids are living in poverty. I think like I said, perspective is important when we think about what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Asia. There's starker levels of trauma, but I think you tell the average person in LA that their public school district, over 82% of kids are living in poverty, that 89% of the school district are kids of color, that there are more homeless kids in LA Unified schools than there are kids in 99% of school districts in America. There are about 20,000 homeless kids. And by contrast, 99% of school districts in this country have fewer than 15,000 kids, period. It opens up people's eyes. And I'll end just by saying, I think in March of 2020, it really elucidated kind of what the role of a school district is, because the delivery of instruction was maybe 5th or 6th on our list of what we had to do when we were closing this system. We have over 500,000 kids who rely on the school district, not just for lunch, like many people remember from their youth, but for breakfast, lunch, and supper. So we closed schools on a Friday, and by Wednesday, we were running what became the largest school-based food relief effort in American history, 170 million meals to our community. We then had to buy up every computer and iPad in the state of California. And then we realized, well, we could give kids devices, but they don't have internet. So we had to buy out tens of thousands of hotspots. And then we realized, well, kids might have a computer and a hotspot, but they don't have a quiet place to work. And actually, Anna and I, early on in the pandemic, were out in the community handing out free headphones to families so that their kids could study in the same room. And it wasn't really until, again, the fifth or sixth, you think of like Maslow's hierarchy, the fifth or sixth thing that we thought about, oh, well, now we have to actually have to train the teachers on how to teach, because we just had to make sure we were taking care of the children. And I think that's another element of this too for our school district, is that this has not only been a traumatic year for our youth, this has been a really traumatic year for the adults who work with our youth. There are 70,000 professionals in LA Unified, from the bus driver to the janitor to the principal, all of whom are dealing with their own forms of trauma, whether they lost an individual close to them because of COVID, whether someone lost a job, whether they're now trying to take care of kids who see them not just as their teacher or their bus driver, but as their de facto parents. So that's the work that we're at now, a year and a half of recovery. And I think, I'm sure we'll discuss this in the coming minutes, but we talk for a lot of Americans in particular, but this was a year where people said, oh, this was traumatic. And those of us who work with kids know that this just exacerbated existing traumas, that these fissures in our society were there, and COVID exposed and exacerbated it, whether it was the quality of your school or your housing or your access to food security. So that has been the work of our board and of the school district over the last year and a half.
Oh, amazing. And thank you all for sharing that with us. I'm already so inspired. I mean, the work that you're all doing is extraordinary. So we started with the trauma, and I want to pivot now to the hope. So all of the panelists are doing some remarkable work on creating resources, acting in the schools, developing curriculum, developing new methods on how their education can be an antidote to the trauma that their audiences are experiencing, developing a sense of self, developing safe spaces to do work, as we've already heard just in your introductions. I'd love to hear more about from each of you, and maybe if it's all right, Dr. Ponce, let's start with you, because you kind of even frame this in the way you introduced yourself. So can you each talk about how education really is serving for an antidote for the trauma that your audience is experiencing, and what are the educational interventions that you're currently most focused on? So Dr. Ponce, can we start with you, and then we'll relax and we'll just go around the rest of the panelists as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start with a quick story that just happened 2 weeks ago that really sort of reminded me of the urgency of this work. And particularly at this time, I was volunteering at my son's school during lunch on Halloween, and this little boy didn't have a costume. He had a sweatshirt and it said greatness. And I said, oh, I love it. We should all aspire to greatness every single day. And he said, yeah, miss, because they all call you miss. I'm just not feeling it. I just don't feel the holidays, and I'm just really sad. And I'm like, oh, why? And he said, because, 3 people died. 3 people that I know died of COVID, and I'm just really sad. Now, this boy doesn't know me from anything, but because I was there, because I saw him, because I talked to him, he was able to share something that clearly was weighing very heavy in him. And that's really reminded me of how we need to approach or do more in this area in terms of creating trauma-informed schools and trauma-informed communities. And to the point that Nick made about the adults, we have to also keep in mind right now the impact of secondary trauma that the adults are experiencing because of all of what the kids are bringing into the school. And how are we navigating, sort of the priorities and the resources to ensure that the adults and the children are healing, are processing, and at the same time can access the academic program. And, there's a lot of communities that are really trying to figure out how to leverage resources. But ultimately, what we need to do is bring kids joy. We need to bring them happiness and connection. And one of the things that Great Public Schools did in partnership with LAUSD and with Nick is we were able to figure out how to open every single Title I elementary school and middle school this summer so that kids can go back to school, so that they could be with their peers, so that they could socialize with kids in a safe environment. And that was really unprecedented. And it also brought in the community-based organizations that work with these communities to leverage their capacity and their resources. And that's another piece in terms of trauma that I think is also important to elevate, is that communities have organizations that have a lot of touch points with families and with children. And right now is the time for schools and those organizations to really leverage their resources to be able to go deeper and support kids even more. And again, you know, we as Nick said, our kids, they have all kids just have such great needs right now that, you know, were because of direct or indirect trauma caused by the pandemic.
Amazing. Amani, John, what kinds of initiatives are you working on to find hope in your communities?
In our community, at the Congo Peace School, we are trying to give a new hope to a generation which have lived in despair or in their lifetime. So the different type of trauma children are confronted with is kind of the general situation and the general context in which we all live in. So what we are trying to do is not only to have the Congo Peace School as a place where children come to learn math and read, but we also try to provide some psychosocial services. What we do at the Congo Peace School is to make sure children are happy. Having a student population of children who are in constant fear, and we all know that fear is the enemy number one of the learning process. So what we try to do is to create some kind of happiness at school by leading the children to play together at school, trying to provide some expressive meditation, music, dance, play soccer. All the time at school, they are happy, and the Congo Peace School has become their home. It has become their home because 75% of our student population can only get a meal when they are at school. Going back home, livelihood is very almost non-existing, and the pandemic has come to exacerbate an already existing extreme poverty. All the small activities that the community members have been doing, as we are on the border between Rwanda and DRC, borders being shut down, and the pandemic has added into the already existing trauma. So what we are trying to provide is, we provide children with meal in addition to the psychosocial services assistance that we give them. But we try to screen the symptoms, and we have found among our children that many of the children are really living in constant fear. You never know what might happen. Your village, the community might be attacked. You might be forced to flee the area. So you don't, in a situation where you're living with fear, anxiety, irritability, it is a cycle of trauma and violence going on and on. But we strongly believe, and many of our children, when it is time to go back home, many of the children don't want to go back home because the school has become their family. But we also try to encourage, to promote social cohesion. Children coming from different ethnicities, children coming from different tribes. We are in a country with more than 450 tribes. So politicians have been also using these tribes to oppose people and continue plundering the country. profiting from that to use the conflict mineral as a way to fuel the conflict, the unended conflict. So we do the dancing, they play together, guided imagery, and when you see what children are drawing during the guided imagery, when you see what children are imagining, they are drawing at the beginning of the school year. We ask them to draw Congo. They draw a Congo with violence, showing guns and violence and rape and whatever. But by the end of the year, after they have gone through psychosocial assistance, they start drawing a peaceful Congo. That is the dream, the Congo of their imagination. It is a peaceful Congo, and that is the end goal of our education approach, which is sort of comprehensive. And that's what we are trying to do.
It's amazing. Before we jump to John or Nick, Amani, can you say a little bit about the curriculum at the Peace School? I mean, our partners in Rwanda and Uganda have a particular peace curriculum for post-genocidal societies where they've integrated testimony and storytelling really as a big central. It sounds like you're integrating play and other kinds of social cohesion activities. Can you say a little more about the curriculum at the Peace School, about what the nature of the Peace School, because I think many people on the call won't be familiar with your work.
Yeah, the curriculum we are using, we have an approach. We have 3 pillars, and pillar number 1 of our curriculum is NPE. It is Nonviolence, Peace, and Education, which is really rooted and based on the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. We are trying to promote social justice through our education approach. The principles of active nonviolence in the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. And we are very happy our children at the end are understanding that the universe is on the side of justice. We as one of the principles, we are trying our curriculum to teach them to be courageous and be able to stand up and denounce what's wrong in the way our country is governed. Corruption is the cancer which is destroying our country, a rich country but for very poor people. But we are raising and educating a new generation of peace ambassadors, and our peace and nonviolence approach is oriented and rooted in the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. We have children who are standing up and organize protests, when a nonviolent protests, when there is something wrong at community level. Our grown-up students are able today to stand up and denounce and say, this is not how it has to be. And we believe that they are a generation which is going to make the change we have been dreaming. In addition to the NPE, the nonviolence peace and education, we have another approach. Our education approach is education for life, healing, and resilience. So in the healing component is where we bring in the psychosocial component, where we do individual and group counseling and all the meditation, all the expressive meditation. We want to make sure we are raising and educating a generation of children who are really resilient and able to fix the problem, able to bring local solution to the local problems of the country. So in addition to the already existing curriculum that Congo has, we are trying also to do a change in what we call, we are raising and educating sons and daughters of freedom and liberty in our learning and education system. Because from the slavery, from King Leopold II, when he won Congo, he promoted an education system where people don't have to think. People are just there to memorize facts and memorizing, and you don't open the window to make sure people can express themselves, can speak their mind. And we are trying to change this by making sure our children are pioneers of freedom and liberty in our education system, and they can speak their mind, and developing critical thinking, and so on and so forth. but also there are take homes. There are takeaway, everyday takeaway from the school, where we link our children with the community by teaching them organic and ecological farming techniques, where they can go back home and can really replicate the practices that they learn from the school, and this links them with the community, and we have seen success in many ways. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. John, what about the methods and strategies that you're using? You alluded to them in your introduction. I'm interested to hear how those are bringing hope for you.
Yeah, so, I'll speak specifically to the world's largest refugee camp with the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, just across the border from Myanmar, where JWW is supporting specifically. But this thread runs through, I'd say, most of Children on the Edge's work with our partners. We work with Dalit children in northern India, who are loosely known as the untouchables in the West, the lower caste. Same rules apply. We work with Congolese refugees across the border in Uganda, not far from where Amani is, Syrian refugees, both in Lebanon and Syria. And I think many of the principles that we found to work or we found to be effective working with children in situations of trauma hold true across the board. So there's a few things that I would say that are signatures of our work. And the first thing is to provide a space that's physically, if possible physically, but at least, emotionally safe and different. So in the Bangladesh camp, specifically for the Rohingya, it's these kind of small undulating hills that have been stripped of all wood, and it's just barren and dusty now. So the first thing we did to set ourselves, apart from the landscape was just go out and went down to the local market and bought them out of trees. Maybe a bit like Nick running around trying to buy all the iPads in California. We were trying to buy all the trees we could buy, and they were just little saplings. That's all we could get. This was back in 2017, but those trees grow and they give a physical barrier. So when a child walks through that gate, there's a space, and that becomes a mental space for them as well. And then they walk into a classroom of color, and they walk into a desk that's got their name on it. And those small little physical things, markers that you can leave for a child, make a huge difference in their approach to education, their feeling of security. And so we found that right away. If you can just create some sort of physical, and if not physical, at least create whatever safeguards in place to give them a break from whatever's around them. And then the next thing we focus on, far beyond anything else, is the teacher, because of course, you can have a fantastic digital classroom with all the bells and whistles, but if that teacher isn't attentive and trained and available to the children, then largely most of what your initiatives are going to fail. And so we spend a lot of time working with our teachers, identifying signs of trauma. Of course, it's very difficult when you're dealing with large numbers of kids to provide high level training to teachers, but at least having them be a referral for the children that are really exhibiting signs of severe stress. And so trying to get those teachers as kind of frontline first aid workers, giving them the first aid skills to then triage the kids that are really, really in need. In the case of Bangladesh, the teachers are not only working in a difficult environment, they have the additional challenge that the textbooks provided and approved by the NGOs there and the government are in Burmese and English, which are not languages spoken in the camp. So it'd be a bit like Nick going there to Watts and saying, okay, here's a really difficult situation, and you're going to teach math in German, and then you're going to teach science in Arabic. Good luck with that. And so again, it comes back to the teacher. If they don't have the initiative and and drive, then the education will fail. And so that's been our biggest barrier in working with Rohingya. What we've done to circumvent that, and with JWW's help, is we then took those textbooks that were approved and we put them into digital lessons in the Rohingya language, which is not a written language, but is a spoken language. And so that literally we could go through the curriculum, and that the students and the teachers would almost be hearing the curriculum for the first time at the same time. But then there was at least some meaningful transfer of knowledge. So that was the kind of the first step we've taken there. And it's been an arduous process, but we're now finally, again, after 18 months of lockdown, finally getting those digital lessons going. One other complimentary thing to that, I'll just say that this is true again across the globe for us, is we dedicate a full day to play in our classrooms. And again, Amani was talking about this, and it's so critical to the development of the children for them to have that space and time to play and just to be children. Because we're finding more and more, especially in the lockdown times, expectations on the children are even heavier. They're just, the age of childhood is just dropping and dropping, it seems, across the board where we work. And so almost, deliberately and, stubbornly trying to protect that childhood, say, no, you're 12, you can still play. You can still, be free to go and do that and act out a silly drama and do something that maybe wouldn't be acceptable outside of these walls. And lastly, and I think this is something we all hear about a lot, is we talk about, the voice of the child, giving the child voice. But how do you go about? I mean, I've been working in this role for the past 10 years. Before that, I was actually in Congo. And this was something that was continually coming up in programming. How do you give the children voice? And it is not, there's not a silver bullet to it, but it's something that we've wrestled with. And we started 10 years ago in the refugee camp by doing printed newsletters. And the problem we had is we had thousands of kids, and you can only print so many poems and drawings and things. But what ended up happening is we started doing the printed newsletters again, and then we had these digital lessons going in the classroom, and the kids came to us and said, well, hey, if you can take these videos and make them for us, why can't we make the videos for other kids? And of course, the greatest discoveries are not the ones you make yourself, it's the ones that are made for you. And they just put two and two together. So what we started to do there was just giving them a blank canvas to say, what do you guys want to do? And it's always been interesting with our younger classes. I typically go in at the beginning. One of the first things we do when we sit down is we'll give them a blank piece of paper and we'll say, draw whatever you want. And this is reminding me of something Amani was saying. And almost without fail, because we have the A for apple, B for bus, or whatever it is, they'll just look around for something concrete and they'll draw that, and then most of the class will end up drawing the apple or something. Like they'll even draw the same thing that most of the kids around them are drawing. And what we try to cultivate through the year is the idea of expectation or imagination, that, hey, why don't you draw something you've never seen? Why don't you imagine something and begin to develop that as a muscle, as an idea? And the evolution I see between our first graders doing that and the kids that have been in the program for a couple of years, you give them a blank piece of paper after a couple of years and you draw something, they'll come up with machines that, I have no idea. But that ability to imagine a better outcome, a different outcome, an unknown thing is so, so critical in all of our programs, and trying to develop that in children so that they have that expectation. It's equally important as to the education transfer that we do, is having them begin to build an expectation and begin to imagine a different outcome than what's around them. Because in Bangladesh, for example, what's around them is, you refer to it, Dr. Street, you hear about the hopelessness and just the lack of agency options there, and there is, and I can't come in and say, well, we're gonna be able to guarantee that. They're pawns, they're stateless in Myanmar, they're stateless in Bangladesh. Nobody's stepping up and saying, hey, we want to take these people on. So their options are limited, and they need to be given the tools to help them begin to make self-determined choices. And I think for the young children, the key to that is a big key to that is giving them the ability to create and imagine whatever they want. And so what that's led to is, I'll do a really quick plug and then I'll stop talking. What we're calling a digital platform. It's mojakids.net, mojakids.net. And it started, I think it was January of 2020, and then abruptly came to a halt in March 2020 because of COVID. But it started with them making their own digital newsletters and sharing video content, so that you had kids in the refugee camp communicating with kids outside the refugee camp. Because outside the refugee camp, they have no access and no understanding of what's there. And then we've only just begun in the last 2 weeks, and we're going to extend that to kids in enclave communities in Bangladesh who are second generation Rohingya. And then we're extending that to Dalit children in India and street living children in Cambodia. And we're just giving kids a blank space to begin to share whatever's on their mind. And so that's kind of the evolution of where we are as an organization. And we're very grateful to have JWW backing us on that digital platform. And I'm excited to see, I'm really eager to actually try to open the platform wider and bring in schools, because my sister's a teacher, they're in California. I'd love to find ways to actually have some sort of a meaningful interaction. But now I'm getting way ahead of myself. So we'll see where it goes. But there's a long answer to a short question. Thank you.
Oh, it's amazing, Nick. Before Nick starts, I mean, John, that's so much that's imbued in what you're saying that gives hope. But I love the concept of providing the skills and abilities for, for more self-determination. That's really, really amazing. Nick, what about you? What do you see that's hopeful in terms of what LAUSD is doing? I mean, moving from Maslow's hierarchy, what's next in the coming year? I mean, what did you learn from last year? That, because we're still not out of the woods, right? I keep having conversations with our educational partners saying, education system is still in flux. It's not back. Like, we're still in the midst of this. So what are you looking towards?
And Dr. Sri can't go back. I mean, I think we talk about this in different areas of public policy, but this idea of not returning to what it was. But I think hearing you all speak, I mean, just despite our different circumstances, there's a universality to what children need right now. And so, I want to touch briefly, but I think that the environment and the outdoor space or the imagination or the teaching or the role of schools, I mean, these were all so salient for LA, similarly to what we're hearing around the world. I mean, I think, there was a cruel irony in LA and around the country, and I think the world. We were calling these quarantine orders or these isolation orders, safer at home. And those of us who worked with kids in schools knew that for a lot of kids, they weren't safer at home, that the school was such an important place, not only on the kind of technical, employees, school employees are mandated reporters, but just for kids to be able to talk to their peers, to talk to that adult like Anna, who was on campus on Halloween. I actually was at your son's school on Friday, Anna, but I didn't embarrass Maki. I didn't go to his classroom, but just that opportunity. And so, I think we are seeing the crucial role that schools play and that caring adults play, not just in the 3 R's, but in creating that opportunity for kids to be with their peers. And that's why I was so bullish in getting kids back on campus. Because not only because of the delivery of instruction, but just because of those non-instructional elements. I think too, the environment that kids are in are critical. I remember when I was teaching in Watts, I had some college friends come, and one of them was walking around our campus on a Saturday and said, "This school is just not conducive to learning." And so, John, it's even in LA. I mean, we are doing a lot with tree people. We're planting trees. We're doing outdoor classrooms. LA Unified owns, and I brought a resolution to fund fully 2 campsites where we're doing programs to get kids out of the city and interact with nature, because there's so many benefits. And I think this was one of the hopeful legacies of COVID in terms of getting us out of our spaces, whether that's outdoor dining or outdoor education. But I found that, when I was teaching, and I actually had to do it once because there was a construction project in my classroom, so I had to leave. But when my kids were outside by a tree reading, it just changed that perspective. It made them more focused, more creative. The art, and I love what you're all saying. I think of Mani about like kids having to see a future, like they have to be able to, imagine a new reality before we have to, and go beyond just like the kind of 4 walls of what they can see. And so we're really investing in the school district in art and music and drama, for the obvious reasons, but also because they're a form of therapy, and I think an opportunity for kids to think beyond their circumstances. We're doing a lot around teacher training. One thing I'm excited about is a micro-credential for trauma-informed practices. So we are working on kind of professional development for teachers to do a course, 20 or 30 hours to get what we're calling a micro-credential in trauma-informed practice. And my hope is to roll these out for other things like special education and dual immersion, but it's going to continually hone teachers' practices. But I think we hear from a lot of teachers who say, I understand my kids are experiencing trauma. Tell me how I can help, equip me and give me the tools. We're also seeing in the States, at least, a huge shortage of qualified caring adults to be in our schools. There's an irony of the bookend of my career so far, where when I started teaching, we lost all the teachers because we don't have funding. Now we have this funding, but there's been this great resignation, as people are calling it, and we can't find people. And so we, for the first time since I've been around, we have funding for over 1,000 psychiatric social workers in LA Unified. We've been able to find 400 of them. So we have funding for 600 mental health professionals to put one on every school. They're not out there. Same with nurses and counselors. And so we're one, trying to figure out ways to grow the next generation of school professionals, but also find different ways and partners and organizations to pivot. Because now that it's 3 months into the school year, we can't just hope these people come, but trying to figure out how to garner resources. And the last thing I'll say too, just because I think pendulums often swing in areas of public policy, and there was a period where, oh well, kids aren't doing well academically, so we have to like drill and standardize testing and all that. And what we lost, and I'm a big believer in accountability in high instruction, but what we lost there was joy and fun, and like what type of people do we want our kids to be, not just what type of students. And I think that as kids are coming back on campus, I'm seeing so many more intentional spaces for, like you all talked about, joy and play, and just kids being kids. And I hope that that's something that sticks around as well.
Wow, amazing. I mean, I'm struck as well by just the common elements that you're all bringing up. And Nick, we should talk after this. We're offering a micro-credential in trauma-informed teaching and story. So it's, I think
Definitely.
we're all doing these things, but a couple of great questions are popping up in the chat. And so I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds or less, what's the most important thing for your audience, most effective thing that we can do to help the children that you're working with? So it's that number one thing for each of you. And you all just got muted.
I'll start. I mean, one, the support for JWW has been fantastic. So if you can back a JWW or Jewish World War II organizations like them, they found us. We didn't go looking to them. They sent their representative to Bangladesh to see the camps, to do their due diligence. And so I think they're a special organization in that they're engaged they want to be engaged on that level. But secondary to that, which would be the other thing I'd say, is they're also mindful of advocacy. And in the tumult of the world today, where you have atrocities going on in northern Congo, there in Kivu, Yemen's fallen off the map, but still there, still rolling on. War still continuing. I can go on and on. You're almost vying for the public's attention, and for the Rohingya, who are in the world's largest refugee camp and remain completely almost abandoned, as it is at the moment. Advocacy can make a big difference. A small amount of advocacy can make a big difference in their future in terms of recognition that they are stateless, recognition that they have rights, rights that have been already agreed to by nations but not followed through on. And so just continue to hold people accountable and our representatives accountable can make a big difference, because otherwise they're just going to be left to continue generation after generation as they have been. So I would say on those two fronts, certainly finding organizations like JWW that go out and find real needs and connect with them in meaningful ways, and then also being active on advocacy, so that not to belittle any of the other issues, but just to keep people mindful that just when the headlines disappear, the people, the children are still there and the needs are still there.
Anyone else? A short answer, 30 seconds before Serena hops on and kicks us all off.
I would like to jump in and say that we would like, from the Congo, we would like really to get opportunities like this and connect organizations doing similar work to exchange experiences and learn from one another. Number two is we just launched a campaign. It is school books for each Congo, for each school child. So we carried a survey on early grade math assessment and early grade reading assessment, and found out that a notable percentage of the Congolese children graduate from elementary and secondary school without knowing how to read. Instead of reading to learn, they still struggle learning to read because they have no access, no contact with books. So we just launched a campaign for books, and for that we need resources. And for sake of sustainability, we want to make sure we have an operational boarding house which can help us generate revenue at the Congo Peace School so as the school is self-sustaining. And 3, a capacity building plan, especially for mental health staff, to make sure we are able to give a new hope to the children. Thank you.
It's amazing. Please, if someone's got the link for your campaign, please drop it in the chat for everyone to see. Nick, Dr. Ponce, any last messages? What would be
I was going to chime in so that Anna could have the last word because she's always good at that. But I'll just say quickly, you know, one, I think, and John alluded to this, hold your elected officials accountable for children. You know, California prides ourselves as being one of the most progressive states in the country, and yet our per pupil, our per student funding still rates near the bottom. And I'll say too that quietly, as folks were looking at what was happening in Washington, $100 billion for school construction was just eliminated from the federal infrastructure bill before it was passed. LA Unified has over 100 schools that are over 100 years old. And that's in a place where we can actually raise money ourselves. And we think about rural America. And so that $100 billion for school construction was just eliminated. So hold your elected officials accountable for kids, and then also get involved in your local school. You know, we are in need of volunteer tutors, you know, volunteer professionals to come on campus, do what Anna did on Halloween and just talk to kids, but really tutoring right now, we're doing a big push, especially after the 1.5 years. And so like, reach out to me. I can put my information in the chat, but, or reach out to your local school and get involved, so.
All right, last word to Anna.
Last words is, you know, really look at the value of the community-based organizations that are partnering with the public school system to support kids, and also acknowledge that in supporting families, you're supporting children. And oftentimes we focus on the student and not on the family, or on the child and not on the family. And we need to do more of a holistic approach where we bring the families in to this healing and nurturing environment that we want them to be in.
Oh, that's amazing. So what I've got is support, connection, advocacy, getting involved and working together. And those sound like some pretty good and easy things for people to do to help you know, break this cycle of trauma. And I think the one thing I would say to all of you, other than thank you, I mean, this has been such just amazing panel for me. I've got like 100 pieces of paper with ideas to follow up with you all on. But if you're not thinking about the role of play, not just for your students, but also for your teachers, I think that's one of the things that we're all facing right now is our adults and our teachers and our caring adults are also, as you've all pointed out, experiencing trauma. And it's so important to find room for them to rest and to play. And it'll really help, I think, with this cycle as well. So I hope all of you get some time to rest and play later today. But Serena, it didn't keep us on time, but I think it was worth the extra 5 minutes.
I think it was absolutely worth the extra 5 minutes. This is a conversation that I could, you know, sit and engage in all day. I wanna thank you, Dr. Street, for leading such an incredible conversation, and each of our panelists. I'm sure that everybody listening was just blown away by the care and the intention and the intricacies that you guys are all navigating every single day. And I also hope that everybody took away something that everyone touched on, which is while our vernaculars are different and the circumstances are different, that the intended outcomes are still the same, that we want to universally teach our young people to first imagine a different outcome than what they know, and then to be able to attain it. So thank you all for doing the work. You know, Imani mentioned briefly that the arc of the moral universe is long, and we all know that if we want it to bend towards justice, that we have to bend it ourselves, and you guys are the ones bending it. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining Jewish World Watch and the Shoah Foundation. We can't continue to do this important work without your generous support. So no contribution is too big or too small. Really quickly, John mentioned advocacy, Nick mentioned advocacy. There is a link in the chat to go on and contact your elected official and to call. The UN has acknowledged what's happening to the Rohingya as a genocide, but the US has not. So call your elected officials, get them to recognize what's happening to the Rohingya people. And again, thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.